nonsense space, continuing the journey of wrestling with Christianity. It's been very rich so far. I'm really excited to continue today. Today we wanted to offer some words of intention and kind of plumb the depths of the space a little bit before we plunge into the dialogue. And we agreed that it would be a good idea to maybe do that as part of the recorded part. Yeah, in the spirit of exemplifying the experiment of what dialogue might look like. So yeah, with that, I just want to invite you all and perhaps anyone who's listening to just take a moment and settle into ourselves, settle into our bodies, settle a bit deeper into our immediate experience. Often beginning with a deeper connection with the breath. Letting the quiet gather. Letting the energy and excitement for this conversation, all of the unknowns before us. Holding that energy. Breathing into it, feeling its fullness. And then beginning to bring a listening into that space. Listening with our hearts, our bodies, and our fullest sensing. What kind of journey, what kind of pilgrimage do we want to invite? What kind of qualities of kinship and fellowship do we want to animate that journey such that the journey itself becomes more important than the destination? And what spirit or spirits we want to invite to accompany us and animate us in the undertaking of this dialogue and the greater pilgrimage of which it points to. Yeah, and as I spoke to before, if there's anything else that wants to be added, please feel welcome. And otherwise, your silence is also a welcome addition to this introduction. All right, then bless you guys, bless the listeners, and bless this conversation we're about to have.
Amen
So
to
we're here
that.
to talk about pilgrimage, the virtue of pilgrimage. Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I cut you off there, Mahon.
No, I was saying, I mean, something we were discussing beforehand, maybe as a place to kind of jump in, was my own experience of pilgrimage, which became very real recently. When I spent August doing the Camino de Santiago, which is from France. So we started in Saint John in France, and then you walk from France across the whole of Spain, pretty much, to Santiago. So it's like 800k in total. It took like 32 days. And you start off like the first day walking over the Pyrenees for like 8 hours, just straight uphill of like 30k. And then kind of progress. It's a very long journey. Like, so what I was saying beforehand was that it was just really difficult. It was the kind of spiritual hopes of a journey that was going to be like, just floating along kind of nicely was not realized. It was like difficult, tired, grumpy, got food poisoning, didn't sleep a lot of the time, completely uphill, feet were just destroyed. Um, but at the same time, I suppose that something that I thought about a lot was that the path of virtue or the path of moral is difficult. Like that was something that kept occurring because there's always like uphill and downhill. There's an easy way, there's a harder way, and the pilgrimage is definitely the harder way. So I suppose maybe that's a place to start, is that why would you voluntarily suffer so much for something? The reason, and it does seem to translate to a lot of life, and that we're all struggling to justify maybe that suffering in some ways and take the easy way too much with technology and all of the options available. So maybe that's a place to jump in. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on that.
Yeah, first of all, I want to say thank you, Jacob, for that wonderful introduction, and I feel that was really beautiful, and man, for sharing that. I want to throw one clarification by distinction on that has always been helpful for me in thinking about pilgrimages, to distinguish between the pilgrim and the tourist, and to engage as a tourist with. They're both an experience of going to a place that's different from your home, but the posture of the tourist is sort of consumptive, and it's also oriented around the notion of comfort. It's comfort and consumption, and this is contrasted to the pilgrim, where rather than trying to intake something outside myself, break it into pieces and be comfortable, the pilgrim is attempting to go through something difficult to come into right relationship with something that is already there. So there's a movement, there's like this movement into a thing to become shaped by a thing as the pilgrim, whereas the tourist is attempting to shape the thing to myself. And I think, man, your description there is so wonderfully embodied participatory experience of being shaped in a rough and difficult and unexpected way by something, as opposed to simply, consuming something in a comfortable sense.
100%. It's like Plotinus and the sculpture, how, in the path of virtue, you get chipped away all the time until you kind of take on a better form. And I definitely felt how abrasive that process was, and in such a short space of time, which is really, I suppose something that's coming up as well is the idea of faith, like requiring faith to undertake the journey at all. Because it did require, I knew lots of people on it that quit, that just stopped, that just gave up, like that had plans of doing the whole thing, but maybe they drank too much one night and then they couldn't get up later, and then they got sunburned. There was like all these obstacles, and people, the people that seemed to finish it seemed to really have something that they were holding on to in that way that got them through it. Exactly the difference between the tourist and the pilgrim, I think, is how much faith you have in that transformative journey.
Well, everything that's been said is magnificent, and the distinction between the tourist and the pilgrim is invaluable. So thank you for that, Ken. And it makes me think. So as I've always connected the question of pilgrimage with the problem of church today and their separation, and church today is full of tourists, not pilgrims, and that's part of the reasons why it's pathological. But I'll say more on that later. It's very interesting. We all know the phrase "know thyself." It's very important that this is in the context of a certain test. It's actually gymnastic. It is not merely let me go through the propositional knowledge about myself. When Socrates is talking about know thyself, and we know Plato's a wrestler, et cetera, so forth, the gymnasium and so on. The phrase is, and Raymond brings this out, we have to see it. There's a logos, know thyself. There's an eros, know thyself. And there's a thymos, know thyself. And the thymos is the gymnastic. And what we have in Western civilization today is we don't have any ways to know ourselves thymotically. And really the truth of ourselves tends to come out in stressful situations. generally, basically everyone's relatively nice when they're comfortable. We're relatively friendly when people don't say things we disagree with. That's not the test, though. The test is, what do you do when you're hungry, thirsty, unhappy? A way to look at fasting is submitting yourself to mini tests so that when you get the big test of fasting because there's no food or something goes wrong, you're ready for it and it doesn't shatter you. We can see a lot of these kind of practices as like, so for example, something that is often, I think, really important to bring attention to is if you're supposed to go pray in your room with the door shut behind you, that means people may think you're an atheist because they never see you praying, right? So you submit these practices of being misrepresented so that the day when you're misrepresented on a big scale, you can handle it, right? And so there are all these other things too, where we can see a lot of the commands of the Bible as not just being a kind of spiritual propositional setup, but a certain actual test, like a pilgrimage, like fast, shut the door, be misrepresented, do these different things. But of course, the question is, why would you do that? Why would you do that? And it brings like, why would you go on a pilgrimage like that? Are you crazy? Like, have you lost your mind? Well, this is what's really interesting. The human does not seem as if they can be fully human unless they do things that you can only understand by doing. That entails the real risk of like giving up and therefore it being a mistake. But it's precisely because you submit yourself to that risk, that is hard, that cannot be understood except by doing it, that it is able to scratch some dimension of the human being, that if it goes through our entire life unscratched, we do not become fully human. And what do we do in a society that basically the only justification for human action is rational? If you don't have a rational justification for it, you're a fool. Why would you do it? Well, then we can't do things like pilgrimages that we seem to need to do to know thyself. And then, of course, we don't know ourselves. And so there's something about the comfort, like the rational thing, comfort, all of those kind of redirect what is rational action in a manner that contributes to our inability to fully flourish as human beings. And as to close the point, the church should be in the business of actually encouraging us to do those non-rational things that if we don't do, we're not fully human. But instead, the church actually, what it does is it tells us that we're already in a difficult situation because the world will reject you and you'll be misunderstood, which is suggesting you're already on a pilgrimage, which in the West, if you're a Christian, it's probably not actually that true because you're the hegemony. You have a lot of power. So this creates this weird pathology where rather than the church kind of helping people engage in those non-rational activities that help us be fully human, like a pilgrimage, it tells us we're already on a pilgrimage. But unfortunately, what that looks like is seeking political power to stop the bad guy, or interpreting our life in a certain oppressed difficulty that then doesn't require us to change anything, as opposed to sending us on a pilgrimage that would force us to change things. So I think this question of pilgrimage and the church are strongly related. I said a lot right there, but I think about this quite a lot. So I really appreciate this topic.
Yeah, and there was something there that I was thinking, which was that resonate, because so many people I met while I was doing it, nearly nobody was doing it for religious reasons. Nearly none of them were actually Catholic or Christian. Maybe they were from Catholic or Christian families, but professed to be kind of atheistic or like vaguely spiritual in the way that Vervaeke described. So a lot of the older people would have been more religious, but for the younger people, it was almost like a backpacker adventure trip, which I thought was very interesting considering it is, a pilgrimage, but there's still that hunger for like exactly what you said, Daniel, like a difficult experience that transforms you, that builds self-knowledge. Maybe you're at a crossroads to make a decision, and there's such a dearth of those kind of initiatory journeys in our society. That's something like that. Like there's people from Korea, there's people from Australia, there's people from South America, there's people from North America. There's people coming from all over the world to just walk this path, basically. I mean, you could go for a walk in your garden or down the street. I like the significance of it is you could see the hunger, even if people couldn't actually articulate necessarily what the hunger was. So yeah, I think, how do you bring that more into religious practice day to day and in your life? I mean, I think you're 100% right. That's what the church should be doing.
I'm extremely concerned that basically, especially American Protestantism, has created the impression that you're actually less likely to go on pilgrimages if you're, say, in American Protestantism, because you're saved by faith, not by works. So actually, it's not only is the church not actually equipping people to go on those things, you could argue there are some theologies that are actively discouraging it. And if you think you need to go on a pilgrimage, well, you've left the community. Why are you so individualistic? There's actually a kind of discouragement that is extremely, and so, yeah, I think actually people who aren't Christian can sometimes be more likely to do these some sort of undertakings, just in the American context. I'm not talking about other contexts. I think what you pointed out is a big problem.
I'm really glad you brought in the pilgrim tourist distinction, Ken. I don't know if I had heard it from you first or what happened, but I've been thinking about it and writing about it recently as well. And it feels very alive for me in the journey that I'm on, living nomadically, which in this day and age is often associated with tourism. So it's become quite important for me to like actually understand the way in which what I'm doing is distinct. I think there's something also about belonging, or homing or unrooting from a sense of a certain quality of belonging, or like the kind of quiet certainty-based existence that Daniel writes about in Belonging Again. To be uprooted, to go on a journey, is to actually be heading towards a destination that you can't actually see yet. It's not yet available to you. And this is really quite different from the tourist who is not seeking to be transformed by the experience. They're seeking to basically take themselves and put themselves into different environments and to have some experiences, but it's not fundamentally about, I'm going to be changed by this. And then there's this kind of like towardness of both a combination of like a path in faith, a walk through life that is made different through embarking on the pilgrimage. And also, I think for me, a real sense that there's a kind of community yearning, and there's a sense of like, there's some sort of experience of collectivity and togetherness that is not yet here, but I'm holding the space for it. And so in that way, the pilgrim walk for me, all these years I've been writing and making things as Culture Pilgrim, it's been a very solitary journey, it feels like, although I found wonderful people along the way, as this conversation attests to. And then at the same time, there's like this like, we're going to leave, Brett Weinstein talks about this in evolutionary terms, like you leave the valley in which you're living because you have a sense like this is not going to be a hospitable place. And that's like an ontological claim about our society. Like we need to uproot from where we are and go somewhere else, and not just in terms of like where we are physically, but ontologically, sociologically, going on a journey to something that's not yet here and is perhaps being realized through the course of the journey.
Just reminds me of the meaning crisis, like in the talk of like home, the domicile, the loss of home, journeying to a new home, and the pilgrimage. There was something Jonathan Pajot said, which a pilgrimage is a physical journey that symbolizes the journey to God. So it's like you go on the physical journey in order to make concrete that more symbolic spiritual journey. It's like a microcosm of that bigger. And of course, God would be rehoming ourselves after the meaning crisis. I mean, that is if you believe the meaning crisis was caused by the death of God. So maybe there's something there.
You know, something that I've been hearing, there's this interesting distinction that you brought up, Daniel, with the pilgrimage, whether it's an enacted actual going out of your own life versus pilgrimage as your life. And I'm curious about that, right? Because there's a sense in which there's a very, especially in the Christian lens, there's a very deep traditional mode of thinking about our lived experience, regardless of how much actual distance we cover in let's say space and time, that it is a pilgrimage, because we all sort of fundamentally experience ourselves as being at home but not at home in the world, and thus we're sort of always in this sort of pilgrim, or at least we have the opportunity maybe to be in the world but not of the world. Like, there's something in that idea, I think, that is very, there's something of the heart of a pilgrim in the be in the world but not of the world. And so I'm curious how, like, I think the actual act of going on a pilgrimage like you did, man, is profound. And like you just brought out that Jonathan says, there's this, you can enact symbolically in a particular instance of your life something that anchors your greater lifelong pursuit of the good, your greater lifelong finite transcendence. But what about in the rest of our lives when we're not able to actually go on? What does it mean to maintain and continue that posture of being a pilgrim in the day-to-day mundane existence?
Excellent. Few things. First, before I forget, there is a very real sense that the culture of tourism in the world today is a new form of barbaricism, where the barbarian goes across the countryside, collecting experiences, collecting things, and moving on. That's basically what we have today.
Rape, pillage, and plunder.
Yeah, and there was an Italian philosopher who made that point. And also you see in Emerson's Self-Reliance, where he warns toward the end that travel can be bad for the soul. There's a point where traveling becomes escapism. Now, he also makes a point that no traveling is bad. So there's all these difficult things, right? So there is this kind of the reason why actually traveling can be so dangerous is because it looks so much like a pilgrimage. It looks so much like a journeying. And the most dangerous things in life look like the good things of life, right? That's where you have to have that active discernment. But that kind of active discernment is more of a philosophical training, more of a philosophical ability, which if you have people not doing that, then they may not be able to discern those fine differences. Like a way to think about philosophy, which of course is a catchword that means many things to many people. Philosophy is not being able to answer the question, but being able to discern between things that look very, very similar. Has a lot more to do with those difficult judgments, those really fine, nuanced distinctions that are not self-evident. The point that is asked, that is a very big deal. So there's another issue in life where there's almost a point where you can't return home until you leave. There becomes a certain age where in order to be able to come back home, you have to be able to leave it, or it becomes not really a home, but a prison or something that brainwashes you and so on and so forth. But once you leave, it is very difficult to come back home or to ever find a home again, actually. And something that's interesting about a pilgrim is a pilgrim tends to be someone on a journey for a home, right? Like the pilgrims go across the ocean, they're looking for a home. A tourist is not planning to live somewhere new or to live in a new way. They're planning to kind of return and basically have photographs where they can, collect some cultural capital or something, right? So the relation between pilgrimage and home is pretty profound. And there's something about paradoxical where the human needs to leave to be. But then it's very easy to leave and just keep going, because what you can also have is the kind of leaving home, but the kind of, I'm just going to leave because they're all idiots and I don't want anything to do with them, kind of like just going off in a kind of rageful way. That looks like a pilgrimage, but actually the spirit of it isn't correct. So there's some sort of profound connection between the inner self and the outer action that makes a pilgrimage and not just a going off or barbaricism in the form of new tourism, right? So this is what to me I think is interesting, because there's this question of, okay, well, what about the pilgrimage of everyday life in different things? Clearly, a pilgrimage actually isn't even complete as a pilgrimage unless it transitions to some sort of inner space, right? Like, let's put it this way. Every journey is a potential pilgrimage if it translates into inner work. But if it doesn't, what was intended to be a pilgrimage was just a journey, you could say, right? So there's a kind of, you have to stick the landing to complete it as a pilgrimage. The reason why, I make a distinction. Now, this is where there seems to be a difference between church as pilgrimage and church and pilgrimage, which is the modern setup that then turns it into church and missions, where then the pilgrimage is external to the operations of the home church, and it really does not become an incubator of pilgrimages, but the going out is missions. That is a spreading of the message of the home base, not a message that transforms the people in the home base and has the people in the church transformed in the process. So this is the early church. It is very difficult. Like, what is Paul doing in Acts? He's constantly what? On a freaking pilgrimage, basically. He's traveling everywhere. The early, like the metaphors that would describe the early church, and I'll pass it on because there's some metaphors that would describe the early church would be something more like traveler, alien, immigrant, undercover agent. These are the kind of metaphors that would describe early Christians. What about today? Community man, rooted, a family man, taking care of the family. You have this movement to language that is very more stationary, right? Is what kind of defines the Christian. Now, I'm not saying that's bad, but you've had a kind of metaphoric shift that then suggests a potential danger. And in that shift, what has occurred is church as pilgrimage, because basically the early church and pilgrimage were very connected together. So the inner and the outer work were very strongly put together, where today it's more like church and pilgrimage, but the and turns the pilgrimage, especially in first world comfort, into missions. Now it's church and missions. And then there's this kind of split between the inner and outer work that creates a bunch of problems, because then the people in the church are like, oh, we're doing the inner work because we're financing we're doing the outer work because we're financing the people that are doing the outer work, and we as a body are doing both. But the problem is the functions of that body are split among the members, so you don't have that transformation occurring. And then in each individual member, and then unfortunately a lot of the missionary people, it's more like tourism. Not to be mean, but very often it is more like an adventure that's not necessarily bad. I mean, we went down and built houses after Katrina. I mean, it's not inherently bad, but it may not have the same quality of pilgrimage. So there's been this historical shift that I think has led to various problems. There's more to say, but I'm going to pause right there, and I'd be curious some thoughts.
One of the things that stuck out to me there, from a personal standpoint, like this notion of leaving home as a necessity is very much where I find myself in relation to Christianity. Like, it's not as if I didn't leave Christianity to the degree that I've left it. I don't know how I feel about that, but to the degree that I've left it, I didn't leave it out of spitefulness. But I left it out of this sense of, you know, as you were talking there about the home base as sort of having the answers that need to be shared to the world, as opposed to a home base being a place from whence pilgrims go out to be shaped and to shape, right? This is sort of the difference between, you know, niche construction as a way of moving into the world versus an imposition of an already revealed truth or something like that. And so, like, I'm thinking about how to, like, what does it look like to return in a way that makes of, like, you know, my whole YouTube channel, the Climbing on Mount Sophia, right? It's very much like pilgrimage is deep in that notion for me. Is this, like, it's this pilgrimage towards wisdom that's never ending, and that is something like that's core to my soul. And Christianity is always there for me in that, but this sense of the church as being a home from whence pilgrimages can happen rather than a fortress from whence, you know, conquest and mission is accomplished, like that feels important to me.
Does it have something to do with like the beatific vision, in a sense that you can't get sitting around. Like, it requires leaving the home base into the wilderness, to the unknown, to have that experience of the truly transcendent. Because that was what came to me. Like, the most interesting things I found were there weren't like physical things that were going on, but they were my relationships to them. They were dreams that I was having that I was writing down. They were things that I was imagining and picturing, and I was listening to the New Testament as I was going and kind of building more of a relationship to Jesus and to Christianity than I'd ever done before. But that wasn't the physical journey in a way, but I needed the physical journey to actually do that, or to even get into it. So I wonder, is it like that kind of, it's almost like the hero leaving the home to go into the wilderness to bring back stuff that for the whole community, in a sense, if you get that insight, you know, it's shared with everybody else.
I think that's very beautiful to hear about more of the inner world of the journey that you went on, and that does seem to me to be the most important part. And even just the changing of one's immediate surroundings can be sufficient to just cause like a deep swell in the unconscious, and like for things to move and things to kind of come up from the surface in dreams and so on. So that's really interesting and also wonderful. Ken, I hadn't clocked for some reason that just this very clear pilgrimage connection in climbing Mount Sophia, but clearly here Mahon has just been on his physical pilgrimage. We have Culture Pilgrim, and we have climbing Mount Sophia, which is so visibly about embarking on that walking journey. One thing that's coming for me in response to like how can we undergo pilgrimage without leaving our physical locale is really drawing on my own experience of, I suppose, the beginnings of my pilgrimage before finding Christianity was a pilgrimage into exploring consciousness and exploring different domains of experience through psychedelics. And one of the biggest kind of visionary voices in that space, Terence McKenna, would often talk about how the shaman's role was kind of to journey out of the known world into the spirit world or into the underworld, and to bring back insights that would come through song or through art or what have you, that would then be nourishing to the community. So in a way, the proliferation of medicine work, medicine ceremonies, which is everywhere in Berlin right now, I have to say, it's all sound healings, cacao ceremonies, plant medicine ceremonies. This stuff is really on the spread. And what it seems to offer is an example of a kind of pilgrimage portal where you can go on that journey, and it's going to stir and move things so that even though you're resting in place, so to speak, that movement is going on within you, and you are going to have to kind of renegotiate and recouple yourself with your surrounding environment as you change. So there's a way in which it doesn't have to be physical.
Yeah, this is I think a really good dimension to bring in here, Jacob, because you're right. Like this psychedelic renaissance is huge here, and the distinction between pilgrim and tourist is essential. Because one of the things about the pilgrim too is that the pilgrim's not interested in staying away from home, right? They're trying to be transformed, to come into right relation with what is more real than what's been available to them so far, such that home can actually become more real, such that home can be built up, and that groundedness. And there's two things here that I want to draw together, because when Mahon, when you were talking about the embodied suffering of this walk as being transformative in your relation to Christ, to Jesus, to the New Testament, to Christianity, right? To wrestle with all these things. And then Jacob, as you're talking about, you know, the journey in the psychedelic space, the journey that doesn't involve your body moving, right? For me, whenever I've done psychedelic journeys, my body doesn't move at all, right? Like I lay down and I do not move for 5 hours, but man, it's a real pilgrimage. And so I'm like pulling those two things together. And I know there's some people doing some really great work in this space, but trying to bring those two things together where it's like, yes, we can do psychedelic journeys, but let's not forget to land them at the end, like Daniel talked about earlier. Like, it needs to land in your body, it needs to land in your home in a way that is a real transformation, and your body can go on a pilgrimage. And like, if we can get these two things talking to each other and moving together, like, that might give us the sort of pilgrimage transformation that we're really needing.
Could you just clarify again what the two things are?
Yeah, the pilgrimage in the psychonaut pilgrimage, to use a term, and the ancient form of pilgrimage of walking the path with your physical body.
That is an awesome point, Ken. It really dovetails with my experience of it as well, because I actually did some psychedelics during it as well. I did some microdosing of mushrooms, so I had some interesting experiences with that. But again, like, a psychedelic voyage is a pilgrimage in a sense, but it's also missing that dull, difficult, mundane, like, really, like, I kept thinking about, like, okay, St. James did this journey, like, he had nothing, like, there was no restaurants, there was no food places, like, he wasn't getting coffee, he was probably sleeping on rocks. Like, there is that aspect of the gratitude that comes from immense suffering that can be hard to get from a purely psychedelic experience, I think. Maybe from something like fasting or something that requires that, I don't know. I think if you change your I'm a big fan of changing your consciousness with chemicals, but there's a bit of it's the chemical that's doing the heavy lifting in a sense. So yeah, I think there's
that
some
can be the danger
there
for sure. Yeah. It's prone to exploitation by tourism, though certainly not, like, as someone who is very much interested in trying to integrate these in a healthy way, I want to point that out, while at the same time pointing out that absolutely does not mean they should not be utilized, or like they provide us with profound opportunity.
Excellent. The better something is, the more prone it is to become its counterfeit. The very fact that psychedelics can have that profound impact is precisely why it can be it can become a source of tourism. It's precisely because traveling to a different culture and seeing new things is so amazing that it can turn into a drug, right? The line between drug and medicine can be thin sometimes, just like the line between pilgrimage and journey. There is always something about a pilgrimage that requires a relation to an unknown. So before the entire world was mapped out, if you just got on a ship like the Pilgrims did and you didn't know what was across the ocean, then it was a journey. It was, you could say, back then, before the whole world was basically mapped out, there was a higher probability that a given example of traveling was also a pilgrimage because there was an unknown in relation to it, right? You couldn't just say, I'm going to consume this. Like, if you go to China, you've probably seen pictures of China before you go, right? So it's less of an unknown. As you move into the modern world, I think Marcel Proust put it very well in Remembrance of Lost Time, where he said, life today is not so much about a journey to a destination, but the kindling of new eyes. And that this is the unknown that the modern man has to engage in. And so pilgrimage always, I think, relates to an unknown somehow. So if you don't have any mystery, beauty, truth, goodness, etc., you can't even have pilgrimage, basically just traveling or journeying. And one of the reasons why difficulty tends to resonate with the unknown is because you don't know if you're going to be able to get through this, right? It's unknown. And then it turns out, wait, I did have the capacity. So difficulty can create an unknown. Something like psychedelics, new horizons, can create an unknown. But there is something, if there's something about the pilgrimage that is necessary for the human to be human, then the only way for humans to be human is to have a relation of the unknown. And we have to look for all of the resources that can provide this. on the question of the connection between like the inner home that was brought up, like staying in place pilgrimage, Simone Weil was, she was big on roots. She talked about without roots, humans die. And then she drew a lot of attention to a concept of attention, which is the ability to really see what is going on in front of you. Well, that would align with Mr. Proust. Like the ability to go, oh my gosh, I'm actually seeing the person there. I'm turning the stranger into a neighbor, into maybe not a mere mortal, like the end of Weight of Glory, right? So you're in the same place, but because of a way of seeing, you can turn the same place into a different place. Now, what's interesting is there is something about human beings that with time, things turn into something else. And what I mean by that is what is home as a child gradually and slowly turns into just a house. A marriage, a love, passion gradually just turns into a grind. There's this kind of entropy that seems to define human life with time, right? Difficulty seems to be the medicine for entropy, and the unknown seems to be the medicine for entropy. When you are able to go on a pilgrimage, the home that was slipping into a mere house or apartment can then suddenly become a home again, because you have gained a certain way to experience it that brings it back to back to its full self, right? Now, what's interesting is, this is what I'll get into, you could argue like the major message of the Bible or the gospel is that all things are new. This is quite strange, because all things would include the things you're looking at. Like, that's part of all things, and it's new. So the message of the gospel seems to scream some sort of new way of seeing, right? Like in psychedelics, suddenly the room is, oh my gosh, right? Like it's something new, right? And so there's something about the Christian journey that is fundamentally about the capacity to experience life as new. Now, I'll close my point here, but there's more to say, is the funny thing about the end of the Bible, when God is on Revelation and he's saying, I'm making all things new. These words are trustworthy and true. Imagine that being like someone just said Jesus is alive. What did they do? The tomb is empty. They rush out. They're so like, well, I got to see it for myself, right? That's a model of what the church should actually be. When you go to church on Sunday, you are told all things are new, and you just want to run back home to see it new then, because you were just told that the world is effused with a light and wonder you didn't know about. Missions is a kind of, oh my gosh, we got to spread the gospel because the evil ones are out there, and we got to be, it's kind of a militaristic metaphor, and there's more to be said. Basically, the church now functions as your weekly checkup to make sure you're not going astray. It's to make sure, like, what do we do? It's like a surveillance state. Did you go to church this week? Oh, yes, you're slipping. There's kind of a surveillance state kind of structure to it, right? And it's also linked with our concept of the Sabbath being on one day a week, and you're supposed to go in and do the rest thing. Now, Paul makes it quite clear that the Sabbath has actually expanded to every day of the week. That's why he doesn't want to have them, because they're like, you can pull the ox out, because the Sabbath is supposed to mark when God shows up, or God did show up. So we should be living the Sabbath all the time. And then the way Paul describes living the Sabbath is as going on a pilgrimage, as going on a journey to see how all things are new all the time. And the Sabbath, in being expanded to all days of the week, is actually the invitation to participate in what God is doing, to so have that kindling of new eyes in your immediacy. The horror is when the church is restricted to Sunday, one day of the week. It's basically suggesting we are not in the age yet of kindling new eyes, right? Well, this leads to a very strange relationship then. You're just trying to maintain the military base. You're just trying to maintain the outpost in this world that you're in, that you're not of. But it is not a place of inspiration. So then you got to make sure all the troops have the right dogma, all the right ideas. So when the enemy shows up, we can tell them the gospel and tell them the truth, and we're not in trouble. That metaphor then does not lead to a place where you go in and they're declaring all things are new, and you're so stunned by this message of beauty, truth, and goodness that you can't help but run out into the world to see all things as new. Instead, from a military metaphor, you go out into the world ready for battle, ready for fear, ready to be rejected. There's not really much room for the cultivation of new eyes, because while you're busy doing that, the bad guys just took over the White House. The bad guys just came into your office, right? So you can't have this cultivation of new eyes. But imagine, again, if the church was a place that had messages such as all things are new, and then you just couldn't help but run out and see the world according to that newness. That's what the church is supposed to be. It's supposed to be the inspiration of the pilgrimage that you are a part of right now, but it cannot do that in its current state if it's metaphorically a military operation for you to be equipped to defend yourself. In fact, the things that you can see are a threat. They're dangerous, as opposed to something that would inspire you to see everything according to this new quality.
Yeah, I love to catch this thread and then spin it in reverse. So first and foremost, really appreciate this deftful articulation of the distinction between going out in a mission mode of the Christian missionary, or in Islam, one of the 5 pillars, dawah, to go out to preach, to spread the message, to spread the good news, and something which is more like a listening, something which is more like a going out into the unknown, to meet with the unknown, and therefore, in a sense, to become unknown also. And this is what I found most moving in what you were saying, because it connects very deeply with my personal experience of the last few years, is like a progressive invitation of more uncertainty and how to stand in that. And that turns out to be a kind of socially transgressive position to hold, which requires a degree of conviction or courage, or being willing to be an outsider, even in the home base, to not have a plan, to not know what it is you're doing or precisely what it's pointing to, and to leave room for God fundamentally is what's meant by this. And I've been part of a community called Uncertainment for the last several years, in which we gather on that theme regularly. And for me, that is where, coming out of the psychedelic experience into the world, this is where the psychedelic experience and the relationship to God gets fulfilled. It's like bringing in the veil of the unknown closer, and then letting God be revealed through these unknown circumstances, meetings with new people, serendipities, and so on. And if we plan our lives too much, then what we're actually doing is removing the space for God to operate, and kind of erecting, like, we're gonna like paint the highway lines all the way down the track, all the way to the grave. Like, we're trying to eliminate the space for the unknown to move, ergo for God to move, and ergo for us to like get somewhere we didn't end up. So yeah, so much more to be said, but I want to leave it there.
Well, I mean, I'll just say that you can't talk about truth, beauty, and goodness without them being unknown, because then otherwise they're just your take on truth, beauty, and goodness and finite. Like, resurrection is fundamentally an unknown unfolding. Like unknown is at the complete heart of the gospel, because unknown is whatever God is doing that is worth honoring and cultivating and being in the presence of cannot be known ahead of time, because if it was, it wouldn't be really God's doing, now would it? And it would fall within a rational calculus. Like, another way to look at this, like, instead of people asking, like Christians asking one another, did you go to church this week, in a kind of surveillance state, it really should be, how did you experience resurrection this week? How did you experience the unknown breaking through this week? What an inspiring and exciting thing. You would be thrilled to talk with other Christians, because what's kind of happened, basically, a lot of Christians are finding the liminal web spaces, a group of people that are all collected by shared individual journeys of unknowns, and we share our testaments of those ways that this newness is unfolding to us. And so that's a place where church as pilgrimage is being emulated, is basically on these liminal web spaces, is church as pilgrimage. Whereas the church that is the communal center that you go to, that is in a building, should also do that. But because of a certain paradigm, it's become church and pilgrimage, which then becomes church and missions. And so then the church becomes the place you visit to get your weekly checkup, as opposed to a place to share. And what you have is, when you have church as pilgrimage, which is then church as relating to unknown, because all pilgrimage is in relation to unknown, then we get together and talk about the ways we saw resurrection this week. Wow, that's really cool. And let's talk about actually how you read that book that helps you see new resurrection in a new way. Oh, that's really wild. Instead of books being something we're scared about, everything then joins the concert of how we all come to see and experience resurrection in new ways. And so the unknown is then a gift. Marcise Blondel in Action made this really important point. He said, you know what the problem is with like knowing something is that you stop caring about it. Once you know how that doorknob works, do you think about it anymore? You know, once you know, this is the irony. We seek certainty. Like we're all taught to seek circuit. The school system teaches you that you know something when you gain certainty about it. Certainty is the condition when you stop caring. So we are literally training people to associate understanding with that which ceases to make them care anymore. What is unknown is that of which has the possibility of being a source of life. And so the unknown, which we've kind of been trained to associate with spooky, scary, and dumb, actually, like it's unknown because you're not rational enough. If you were really rational, it wouldn't be unknown. No, the unknown is the birthplace of care. The unknown is the birthplace. And then a church that was centered on that would then be a place of care, and you would feel cared for, and you would feel like you could participate in that care. And it wouldn't, right now, a lot of people, in my opinion, a lot of Christians who have kind of reached that place where church is pilgrimage, like they're together, then go to a church in their town and feel a certain alienation. But actually, in a funny way, that very alienation then speaks to what Paul is actually talking about. You'll be in the world, but not understood. You won't be known. And yet, because of the superstructure of the current church, that feeling means you're in the wrong, as opposed to you've reached the third step in this kind of journey where you go start in a home base, then you go on a pilgrimage, and the last base is home base as pilgrimage, right?
Yeah.
But that step then would require a macro framework to sort of change. And that gets us into some other things. So there's this third leg that is really, I think, critical. Anyway.
We're going to have to do another one.
I agree.
Well, it's something that I mean, Socrates plays a lot here, right? And I think of, you know, the unknowing of the Christian mystics. I've been reading this book, Zen and the Birds of Appetite, right? It's Thomas Merton, and it's a sort of a compilation of Thomas Merton and D.T Suzuki's relationship and correspondence in this place where Zen and Christian mysticism come together, which for D.T Suzuki is a lot about the life and work and ideas of Meister Eckhart. And all of this comes down to the knowing of unknowing, right? And that's really the ultimate place that every pilgrimage is oriented towards in a sort of nested hierarchical goal. The real telos of pilgrimage as such is to join in the inner life of God. And that is the knowing of unknowing. Like that is that place where even D.T. Suzuki talks about this realization, not that the self has become fully emptied, but that the self is realized to have never existed at all.
Right.
And, you know, this sort of radical unknowing that comes over time with an ongoing pilgrimage into the unknown, such that your very life becomes one experience of acceptance and joy of encountering that which you do not know, such that what is behind and internal to you becomes unknown, and what is external to you becomes unknown, but not in a way that is overwhelming, but rather in a way that is endlessly inviting, that is endlessly sacred, right? Sacred in the Vervaekean sense of an infinite well of intelligibility.
That was 100% what was coming up for me there, Ken, as you were speaking, was that notion of the inexhaustible font of intelligibility and sacredness, and not trying to use it all up by knowing all of it and categorizing all of it and saying like, oh, I've stuck it all into boxes, so I'm safe and everything's okay. Actually learning to love that there's mystery and there's more mystery and there's more mystery, and that's like the ultimate way to see the world. Like that, if you can fall in love with that mystery, you're going to be okay. Like that's going to be that's going to feel pretty good because there's going to be a lot of it. And so, yeah, that idea of new eyes that Daniel was talking about, for me, that really seems to be, you know, where you can make that connection, that's the fruit of pilgrimage, maybe.
This is
Well,
such sorry. Yeah, I really feel like we've gathered onto something very beautiful and evocative for me, with these last few threads. And so I was listening to Daniel and kind of picturing, like, you know, this church where we really are invited to see with new eyes. And I was thinking about an experiment that Timothy Leary did at Harvard back in the day, in which he actually gave people psilocybin during a church ceremony. And many of them had profound experiences. One of them ran out all over campus and tried to, like, tell the dean of the college that the kingdom of heaven was near or something like this. The reason I bring that up is because
People listened.
It's dangerous. What Daniel's describing is dangerous. Dangerous to those institutions, but also dangerous to us as people, because we don't know how to play together as adults. Like, that's what I'm realizing when we get into these places where more of this fixed structure of, like, we're going to do the same thing every week. As soon as we start to take some of that away and bring the unknown in, all of that, like, unsafety, childhood shit, like, all of it, like, we have to be able to play together. And there's something in the course of this whole dialogue and the course of my journey, increasingly being on this nomadic pilgrimage, is that the stress of the conditions that we create by embarking on this journey are the precise conditions which demand faith in proportion to that. And it's precisely that quality of faith for me that is like the hand that I need holding my hand as I walk into whatever that thing is that is the unsafe unknown that God is calling me towards. And that could be very different things for different people, but there's a kind of courageous walk into the unknown, and there's like a tender sense of, like, I am held by God. I am like the great mother, however we want to relate to this, a sense of it's all going to be okayness that affords that, like, step into.
Excellent. One of the most consequential conflations, perhaps, in the English language is a conflation of know and love. It's been a disaster. When we say, oh, if I love you, I know you. So there's no mystery. When the Bible uses the language of know, it tends to be intercourse, sex, like you knew someone, so you had sex with them. And sex is an act of being with someone in a mystery. It points beyond itself towards something. But what we did is we took know to mean love, and therefore love is not an honoring of the unfolding of a mystery, but a knowing someone according to a rational calculus. And that doesn't tend to be very good for happiness. We should do everything in our power to remove the conflations of the word love and know, because we should only use the term know in a love context if it's a with them in a mystery. The Bible almost suggests that you know someone when you're with them in the presence of mystery, because you know that they don't know this thing either, but you're in it together. And I know you because I know you're hand in hand with me toward this mystery, right? Like you were speaking of the church in that way. Very important. You know, the veil is torn when Jesus dies, right? Like the Holy of Holies, all of these different things. Let us not forget that the Holy of Holies, the Ark of the Covenant, man, you touch that thing, you die. You go in there and you don't cover your face, you could get destroyed. That whole strange spirit of, like, beauty, wonder, worshiping, danger, weirdness has been unleashed upon the world, basically. And that, like, how would church feel if it was like, hey, we got to figure out how to live in a world with this spiritual force that seems to be a mixture of beauty, death, goodness, hope, and all of these different things. We forget that the Holy Spirit would still have the same characteristics as the Ark of the Covenant, going into the temple where they have to bow their head, only one person can go. That force that is a combination of mystery, power, reverence, fear, wonder. That is the Holy Spirit, not merely this I love you feeling, which then, worse yet, love equals no. So Holy Spirit is how I know people according to irrational calculus. Oh, okay. No wonder then the church becomes just a certain ordering and keeping out the unknown. Because if the church is supposed to be a place of love, love means you know someone, and the spirit we're supposed to cultivate is a spirit of love which equals know one another, then the church is a place where there's no mystery at all. In fact, the presence of mystery would be hatred, right? Because love equals no. And so if there's any unknown in the church, it would be an evidence of a failure of the church. Lo and behold, Ivan Illich was correct then that the Christian church, which was for him the best of things, had become the worst of things, because only the best of things can become the worst of things following the inversion principle for Ivan Illich, right? So when you have a place that is supposed to be honoring this mystery, that then because of some fallacies ends up in the destruction of mystery, then it can become very pathological in different ways. And I'm afraid that's currently what you have. And the thing with it, I would say, is a way to think about the difference also between the pilgrim and the journey is like the journey or the traveling is the go-to, where a pilgrimage is go and see. Like a pilgrimage is always a go and see. The temple's, the friggin' stone is rolled away. Go and see. Leave this church. Go and see how all things are being new. Go and see how resurrection is occurring. Do it at your workplace. Do it in China. Do it in, yeah, you can travel. Go do that. But wherever you go, you must see. The pilgrimage can never be separated from the act of seeing. You are go and see, not merely go to. So if you go somewhere, but you don't learn how to see, following Attention by Simone Weil, you haven't engaged in a pilgrimage at all. You know, why is difficulty seem to be part of pilgrimage? Because when you encounter difficulty, you go and see if you can handle it. And then you see the world quite differently, according to the things that you have gained through that training, through the martial arts. I did wrestling, long distance journey. Like, it changes the quality by which you experience reality, right? For one, it makes you more confident, and it's very hard to see the world if you're afraid, right? Like what Jesus is obsessed with courage. Like he's like, don't be afraid, don't be afraid, don't be afraid. Hard not to be afraid, though, if you've never been on a difficult pilgrimage, because you probably should be afraid, because you don't know if you can handle things. But when you go on journeys that are difficult, it's easier not to be afraid, and courage and sight are strongly connected. Your ability to see and your ability not to be afraid are strongly connected. And if you're afraid, how are you ever going to deal with the unknown? This is the issue. Like, if you can only go on pilgrimage if you're connected with the unknown, but you got to have courage. And so courage becomes some sort of precondition for the possibility of having a relation to the unknown, and therefore only a courageous church could be a place that could house this kind of relationship with the unknown that would bring to the forefront the living spirit by which we could be inspired to see all things as new. So I think separating love and knowing would be a good start.
There's something there. This might open up another thread that'll completely derail us, but this idea of, I don't know what if it was after Augustine, but the idea in the church that God is incomprehensible and unintelligible, which became church dogma, which is still church dogma as far as I'm aware, but prior to that, God was incomprehensible but not unintelligible.
Exactly. Yes.
You could journey to see God in a sense, but if God is unintelligible, there's no point in doing anything, because you can't, that vision isn't possible for you. So I think to have that pilgrimage mechanism, God has to be intelligible. There has to be, the faith has to lead to vision, the beatific vision. So you undertake the difficult journey to be able to see, to have that relationship with God. I mean, vision is a metaphor for understanding. So an understanding of God has to be possible to precondition this journey. And I think in church dogma, as far as I'm aware, in the Nicene Creed, that's not actually there at the moment. So that seems to be a conflict.
So yeah, I'd be curious to hear more about that, because that's not something I've come across. Because that definitely destroys the whole enterprise. If God is unintelligible, then the whole thing is.
Yeah, because Augustine, as far as I understand, ran afoul of it, because he initially had the idea that a lot of his was about this idea of a journey, that we're all spiritual refugees searching for home, and we find that home in God. So, but it's like
hearts are
Platonism,
restless
like
until they find rest in thee.
yeah, like you have to understand the good in a sense. You have to understand God to have this relationship with it. But as far as I'm aware, after the Nicene Creed, that was a problem for him. Like he couldn't say that anymore. Maybe that's been changed. I don't know. But as far I have read some stuff in terms of church doctrine that says that God is incomprehensible and unintelligible. And I know there's certain strands of, say, Protestantism that would interrupt that mystical ascension to God. But that seems to be a problem with the church that would be interrupting approaching it, because it has to be possible for you to actually, try and do it.
Yeah, if you try to maintain that position, you necessarily end up in atheism. You have to. Like, atheism is the only proper response of an intelligent being to a God that is unintelligible. Just by, like, de facto, it has to be. Because if God is unintelligible and we are intelligent, then he's not God.
So that doctrine arose in response to the fear of heresy, that people would start coming up with their own ideas and it would collapse the church. So out of fear, there was then a movement from simple incomprehensibility to unintelligibility. And incomprehensibility then moved from full he was incomprehensible in the sense of fully knowable, then became at all. So then you would have a church that you knew could stay together, because you wouldn't have to worry about the Gnostic controversies that then with Athanasius, although they had this trouble of like, well, how do we decide which books of the Bible are the actual books versus Gnostic and different things? And they were concerned about a resurgence of these different things occurring. But whenever the church does something out of fear, it tends to have a lot of unintentional consequences. And as a result, too, basically that debate can be summed up by the debate between Karl and Aquinas on the analogy of being. And what Karl warned is, like, there's this idea. It also is a result of trying to fit God of Judaism and Christianity into Greek categories, where you're trying to say, okay, God is transcendent. Well, what is transcendent is unintelligible, or else it's not transcendent. And so us actually saying that God is unintelligible somehow honors and magnifies God's glory, actually, because he is beyond human conceptibility. Well, the category of knowing God is more incarnational, actually, not utterly transcendent Now, I know that the actual Greek thinking, the original thinking, is much more nuanced and true, but the problem is history is often written by the bad interpretations, then there's all this work of having to go back. So what you then had is a kind of notion that unintelligibility would magnify God, actually. But that's not what Jesus said. Jesus does not tell us, this kind of notions. He's more incarnational, and the Spirit is alive in you, and you have this kind of double participational language that is going on. And so, but what ends up happening is like, well, Karl is like, because when he's attacking the analogy of being, and the analogy of being is kind of the idea that when I say God is good, even when I say it as a finite being, has something to do with the goodness of God. Now, it may be infinitely less than what the word means, but it has to at least have 1%, 1% of something to do with what God means in his goodness, because otherwise, why not just say God is cat, or God is random color, or God is XX square, right? If language has no connection at all in its descriptive power, then what God is, then what in the world are we even getting at, right? Well, someone like Karl Barth.
Jump on this,
please.
Yeah, I really appreciate this, like giving the historical context of it. But I want to just completely reject the notion that God is unintelligible based on firsthand experience. I think there's absolutely a ratio religio and a possibility of greater conformity. I think true prayer is a direct testament to intelligibility. It's a enactment of a possibility of calibration with God that has very direct feedback on our experience. So no appeal to scriptural authority on that one, but I want to stand in that. And I also like kind of a meta observation on the course of this conversation, because we've spoken so much to the nature of the church, and like, what is it that we're doing in relationship to church here? Should we be trying to go back to that? Are we trying to go beyond it, and so on? Like, in the course of this conversation, and I really feel like the depth of locality from you, Daniel, like in relation to the church, like when you're talking about it, I really feel like this is something that's happening down the street that you're in relation to. It's not a conceptual experience. But in the context of this dialogue on pilgrimage, I also feel like in some way, there's like a sense that the space of the conversation really extends quite a lot, like beyond the dialogue around relationship to church. Or like that in some ways we're getting like eddied around like going back to what's the church's position on this, where this like in some way can simply be an invitation to like this notion of pilgrimage is something that's available to all, and it can be spoken of from that standpoint. Like there's a kind of space of offering this journey and this conversation which has a lot less conceptual boundaries and edges within it, and is simply about the journey of life coming back to source, coming back into relationship to God. And so I want to make sure that the exploration actually feels like it's bringing me closer to God, and not simply into a more well-postured understanding of my difference with the church.
Mm-hmm. It's like a way of pilgrimage versus tourist is a distinction of a way of being that goes to the bottom of your moment to moment lived existence.
Well, basically, church is a pilgrimage, or it's not even church. Like that's the main kind of take, is that what has happened today is there is a separation between church and pilgrimage. And actually, if you go on a pilgrimage, you're trying to be saved by works, and that's unholy. Like the main kind of idea that has happened in Protestantism is like, because unintelligibility is holier, like to believe God is unintelligible is holier, actually. Well, then it's holier not to go on a pilgrimage, and it's holier not to do philosophy. And it's holier not to be engaged in dialogos community. And if you ask deep questions, you're actually a bad Christian. So what you end up happening is you have a historical narrative that is developed that has actually made the church antithetical, like against the very things that we are describing, where if you do them, you're actually kind of made to feel as if you're a bad Christian, when really looking historically, it's the exact opposite, actually. Like when you go to Paul in different things, the church was a pilgrimage movement, and now they have been separated, which has caused to all sorts of feelings of picking one or the other. And that has led to, I think, a very pathological church, actually. Because like, for example, when Paul is saying, you know, you're going to be rejected, you're going to, you know, people aren't going to understand you. Well, that makes a whole lot of sense if you're a pilgrim, if you're going into like as an immigrant or an alien into a foreign country, right? But what do you do when like you live in America where the predominant culture is Christian? Well, you're like, well, I'm not actually rejected at work for being a Christian. So what you end up having to do is emphasizing the narrative of the church to feel like Paul wasn't wrong, then has to somehow turn Christians into victims of some sort of political class, some sort of college class. Like there's all these forces that you're actually being oppressed by, that you, by just being a middle-class American, thus you are actually on a pilgrimage because you're going to work in the face of all of these difficulties, right? No need to do anything extra. You're actually already there just by being Christian in a Western society. So you have these conceptions of what a pilgrimage is that have been counterfeit by the notion of church, that once you deconstruct them, then you can see that the only way to be Christian involves a pilgrimage in the way that we are describing. Which in Paul's day, church and pilgrimages were two sides of the same coin, because you were going into foreign countries. You were traveling, and the church was people gathering together to see, where did your pilgrimage take you? Where have you been thinking about? What resurrection did you see? Like we gather here on the dialogos to talk about the things that we've been going through, right? Well, that's church, because that is people on Mount Sophia who have been climbing, coming together to say, what paths did you take? Which ways did you go? Church is to be helping aid the mapping and the carrying out of the pilgrimage. And basically the point of this would also mean is that you could, in a sense, be going more so to church by never going to American church if you're going on a pilgrimage. And there would actually be a historical basis for that claim, which to us is very hard to think now, because that would mean that being Christian has something to do with journeying into the unknown. We associate love with knowledge, and as a result, it feels like it's loving not to do those things, that we need to be actually to engage and participate in a world where all things are new.
No, it's really helpful, actually, kind of integration of what I was reflecting, and it just kind of brings me back to the sense that like church is where I'm experiencing most connectedness to God in the presence of communitas. I think I want to offer that as a kind of a distilled rendering. I also wondered, Ken, if there was more that you wanted to say about this idea that it's kind of somehow underneath Christianity, even perhaps what we're talking about. And yeah, also Mahon, any reflections that come for you as we approach sort of the half-hour mark?
Yeah, I would say, probably my closing remark and sense would be, first of all, thank you all. This is wonderful. This is lovely. I have, I think, taken on pilgrimage as an existential mode. I think it's fundamental to the notion of love. I think it's another way of saying love as a way of being. And as I referred to climbing Mount Sophia, that's part of that for me. But for me, it's everything. It's every encounter with myself, internally, with reality, externally, with others, with ideas, with God, with transcendence. Having the posture of this sort of wrestling with niche construction. I change it and it changes me with every level of of being in the world, physically, emotionally, spiritually, psychologically, relationally. Every moment of attention is this give and take, this shaping and being shaped. Never simply an imposition or simply a reception, but always a wrestling with, always a moving, always a changing, always a transformation. That sense, I mean, I think that's that sense of being at the boundary line of meaning making, the boundary line of chaos and order, at the boundary line of that. And I think that's what the pilgrimage is, the lived experience of meaning.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. It actually made me think that something that really disappointed me about the pilgrimage that I did was that it didn't feel that different to what I do all the time anyway, aside from the massive amount of walking that was involved, because I'm always trying to have those insights. I'm always considering spiritual things. I'm always trying to have those new eyes, trying to kind of see into the mystery more deeply. And I thought that was initially a negative thing, but just hearing you speak there, Ken, was like, that just reaffirms that that pilgrimage is everywhere. It's a pilgrimage as a way of life that you can really imbibe, and really for me is what philosophy is about, the love of wisdom, and also that scales up to the love of God, which is I think part of that is that pursuit of truth, something that might be missing from the institutional version, but for me that feels really meaningful and really like connects me to the transcendent in a way that, you know, has done so much good for me, and I think could do so much good for a lot of other young meaning crisis people in the current state of affairs. So yeah, thank you very much for this dialogue. Like, this is really, I feel like I've been on a pilgrimage. This is good stuff.
Yes, I feel the dialogue is getting more beautiful the more we develop it as well. Like I definitely have that sense as we close out today, like each of us is getting sort of closer to speaking the most beautiful speech. And I was thinking just before this dialogue that that's what prayer is, and that's why it's so devastating that we've lost prayer, is that prayer is actually the place where we should have the most beautiful, good and true speech. So yeah, any further reflections for you, Daniel? Very welcome as well.
Well, I just want to say that I really enjoy speaking with all of you, and when Paul's writing, none of the Christians would have grown up in church. Like home, pilgrimage, church would have been the order. What's made church so hard to understand is that we grow up with church. And so church then is that place you grow up with, and the function of church then reflects a place for families to grow up in. But like in the early church, most people would have been something like home, then pilgrimage, and then church, actually. And church would have been the shared spirit. Like, this is what's tricky now, is church is something we kind of grow up with. So when we talk about going back to church, there's a regressive feel to it, because it's like, well, I grew out of that, right? And you see, that really wouldn't have been a thought that would have been as much of a problem back then, because most people wouldn't have grown up with church. And church, you know, what you'll see in Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, those like Nicholas Berjayev, Bukakov, Lamb of God, you know, they'll emphasize the Sophia as this wisdom. And what's very interesting about Sophia, I think it's Lamb of God, where Bukakov talks about this question of, we need to think of God when we say first calls, there's a mistake, because it's actually, because then you have all the predestination stuff. And what he's like, Sophia is the continual presence of the creative act of God in every moment of time amidst us with the presence of the Spirit. So then church becomes Sophia in a very profound way. And then it's like, oh, the bride of God, I get it. Sophia, Psalms, Lady Wisdom, and so on and so forth. And so if one, we can kind of understand, okay, one of the reasons I culturally associate church with like going home and being a kid is because you grew up with church, but that's not what Paul could have meant when he talked about church, because that wouldn't have been what it was. Okay. And church seems to be something that is a result of people on a shared pilgrimage, because they're going and sharing the gospel and going to different communities. Oh, okay. Church has something to do with brothers and sisters on a pilgrimage that are honoring a shared Sophia, continual creative act in that presence. And so then church are the conditions of keeping alive Sophia. And of course, Sophia is love of wisdom, but Sophia is also the bride of God, which is like the cultivation of wisdom. But then if you can only know yourself by going through difficulty and trials, loving wisdom requires what? Difficulty. It requires going on journey. You can't actually love wisdom unless you go through the trials, right? So then Lady Sophia, in this sense, is a lady that also inspires us to rise to the occasions of trials and tribulations that we didn't think we would be possible, precisely so that we can be better conditions for the arising of Sophia amidst us. And that then is the continual presence of a creative act, without which we fall into the meaning crisis, because you can basically only deal with the meaning crisis by having a continual source of becoming and meaning known through as Lady Sophia. And so I think part of this conversation too is the regaining of a concept of Sophia that I think is actually quite useful and important. And that would speak to Mount Sophia, as I'm saying. Yes, that's exactly. So that's like that notion of the love of wisdom. You cannot have church without Sophia. So where the Christian then, like, I think people like us who basically realize that, and you kind of know that church has something to do with Sophia, the hanging question is, okay, but how do I relate with the church I grew up with? The kind of the organizational church. What should my relationship to that be if the people there may not have gone on the pilgrimage to know that church is supposed to be something about Sophia? And that gets into different practices, different skills, different ways to think about it. That gets in kind of nitty gritty things. But we can at least we can at least free ourselves from the subconscious feeling that we're doing something wrong by associating church with Sophia once you look at the historical case. You look at the historical case and you say, oh, I actually have a basis for this. It's not me just wishing that church was dialogos, that church was these kind of things. No. Church actually is a lot to do with Sophia. I don't have to feel guilty about that. Now, I do need to maybe think about how I would relate that with the community church, with the people on the ground, because there is a danger with the more Sophia-inclined Christian to then not interact with their community and to get into their bubbles, and there seems to be a danger there. But at least we can move beyond acting out of guilt. You know what I mean? Like worrying about guilt. If we can move beyond that, then we can take on those practical questions, I think, from a better footing. So I've appreciated the conversation.
Beautiful, beautiful closing reflections from everyone. And Daniel, you never disappoint. Such a potent insight of church being the thing that comes after the pilgrimage and not necessarily before the pilgrimage. So yeah, amazing dialogue. Thank you guys so much. I'm going to close off the recording here. Thanks everybody for listening. To be continued.